So our next speakers are what is already happening. First speaker is going to be Norm Groot, who is, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you know, is Executive Director of the Monterey County Farm Bureau. And he's going to talk about what are we already doing from an agricultural side. And then Brenda Granillo, who's District Manager for Cal Water, and she's going to talk about what's already being done and the successes that are already taking place from an urban side. That sets the stage. And then we're going to move back to Derek, and he's going to talk about what can we do, what might have to happen. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Norm.
So as a matter of background, I wanted to provide a little perspective first on my involvement on sustainable groundwater management. I'm sorry? And how I came to be involved in this. First of all, our organization, Farm Bureau, was very much instrumental in some of the language that ultimately ended up in the act when it was signed by Governor Brown in 2015. And then here locally, our organization was one of the key movers to form this GSA, this Groundwater Sustainability Agency, through the Joint Powers Authority that was ultimately approved through the county. So been involved in this from the beginning, understanding how this is going to work through the process and what we need to do locally here to achieve that sustainability in the next 20, well now 17 years. So we'll see how we get there. But first, I was asked to cover what agriculture has done in water use in the last decade and a half, last quarter century, and then move more into what agriculture currently is doing either for practices or on-farm use of water and how that is evolving and changing all the time here. So first,
you can speak up, I'm sorry. If you go any louder, that'd be great, thank you. Sorry.
I'm usually loud enough without a mic. All right, so first I wanted to cover the agricultural water use, and this is taken from the Water Resource Agency annual reports of extractions from the Salinas Valley Basin that they collect. They started this in the mid-1990s, and so we have a lot of good documentation going back almost 30 years now of our extractions throughout the valley. And while these borders of this extraction report are not exactly the same as the groundwater basin that we're talking about here, it's pretty close. And so it's a good representation of what agriculture has been doing for the last 26 years now. And I emphasize the fact that I started in 1996 simply because the first couple of years they were still working on formulation, and I thought that was a good starting point for looking at the numbers. So if you see here, 1996, 563,000 acre feet were extracted for irrigation. And 26 years later, that's 447,000 acre feet. So that's a reduction of 20% over that 25, 26 year process. That's 115,000 acre feet that agriculture has saved in irrigation use or become more efficient in. And that really includes some drought years. Obviously, as what you saw on Derek's graph, we had several drought years in there too, where water was not necessarily as readily available, but it does amount to a substantial 20% reduction in irrigation use over the last quarter century. And that's in addition to roughly 5% of agricultural irrigated lands that we increased in that period of time. So increased more lands that we're irrigating, but using less water. So how did we get there? What did Monterey County farmers or agriculture do to reduce those irrigation extractions in that time? First, we decreased water use through better yields and better use, better agronomics. We responded efficiently because the cost of pumping in electrical situations obviously is increased. Everyone gets a bill every month, you know how much it costs. And the use of technology, and I'll go into all of these as we go through the various different practices and methods that we're using right now in the fields. But I wanted to give this perspective to show that, you know, it's not a steady line. Agriculture has been, for the last quarter century, becoming much more efficient in how we use water here. And mainly because we are a very intense agricultural situation with multiple crops per year, multiple turnovers of fields. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the areas that agriculture is currently using to increase that efficiency. And the obvious one to start with is microirrigation, or drip irrigation as some people call it. It's now utilized on 82% of our production fields. It targets water directly to the root zone of the plant and minimizes evaporation and runoff, but it can't be used on every crop. It's not a solid use for every crop, and simply because some of those crops are mechanized in the way that they're harvested, and others simply because of the end product that's produced. We have a lot of interest in precision irrigation practices, the use of soil moisture sensors, weather-influenced irrigation controllers, and weather stations that help us understand humidity, wind, temperature, those types of things. Computerized irrigation cycles, rather than having someone go out to the field and do this and decide that they have to irrigate and turn on a valve for 2 hours, we're now controlling a lot better on tablets and computers and understanding that better. And we apply water now more often when we know the root zone is receptive to that uptake. So we're avoiding that flood irrigation overwatering system that a lot of fields are still recognized as a prior use, but no longer a system of what we're trying to do here. So let's talk about compost. This is something that's becoming a big talking point, not only in fields, but in rangelands as well as vineyards. We're adding compost to soils for moisture retention, as well as reducing the evaporation and runoff. Mulching in vineyards is gaining more use, and it suppresses weed growth at the same time, so it's multi-benefit. We lower the irrigation water needs by using compost, and regulatory programs are now providing those incentives for growers to start using that more often. And now we're looking at biochar and what that can do to help improve water efficiency and moisture retainment in fields and vineyards. We're also improving crop selection and rotation. We're using more water-wise selections and varieties in what we do. That's a constant research area that we see a lot of breeders that are continuously looking for, increasing drought tolerance. We all know we go through those cycles, so we're increasing as much as we can to tolerate those different cycles. Heavy crop rotation enhances our soil health. We have a great system that's been developed over the last 4 or 5 decades where we're rotating between strawberries or some berries, then going into a leafy green, and then going into a vegetable crop. This helps not only with the soil health, but also maintaining diseases in those soils. And then diversifying of crops really aids in irrigation cycles and water use. Conservation tillage is something that a few growers have started experimenting with and having some success with locally here. It's a lot harder to do in a crop system that we have here with intense agricultural production like what we have for leafy greens and vegetable crops here. But we are doing more research into it, and there is more experimentation in deciding whether or not low-till or even no-till is something that we can use here. That improves moisture retention as well as carbon sequestration in those soils, minimizes the soil disturbance and creates less dust in the air. And then scaling and regenerative techniques is something that we're looking at, but it's very difficult to do in the types of crops that we do, particularly the quick turn cycles that we have here for our crops. We're doing a lot with reclamation. As we're all aware, we have the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project that is currently in operation and has been for the last 25 plus years now. It is using reclaimed water on fresh food production. It was the first system in California to be approved for fresh food products. Currently irrigates about 12,000 acres of land in the coastal zone. Reduces groundwater reliance in that area where we have the seawater intrusion, and you saw that area on the map that Derek showed earlier. And it needs less treatment than drinking water. It's really what we classify as tertiary water rather than drinking water quality. So it's not as expensive to produce for recycled our reclaimed water. We want to maximize the expansion of CSIP as we can. We're currently looking at optimization, and there is an expansion for what we call phase 2 that we could be doing at some point in time. But the idea here is to minimize the impacts of seawater intrusion in the coastal zone area by stopping or reducing the groundwater pumping there. And then it optimizes what we're doing as far as growing our crops in that area and being very productive with the water that we have. Again, irrigation water management, a lot of computerized systems, particularly in closed environments like greenhouses and cannabis production, that they're able to control their environments using scheduled systems that provide a lot of input as to when it is best to irrigate. Forming those decisions around soil moisture, climate fluctuations, and temperature and wind. All of that coming together to show when is the best time to irrigate. Technologies involving multiple crop varieties as well as pulse irrigation. Those are things that are really being looked at in those closed environments. And then irrigation technologies are constantly emerging. We have an innovation center in Salinas that is providing a backstop for a lot of these new innovative processes and entrepreneurs, I'll call them, as they come up with new ideas that we can find some field test plots to do their field trials on and prove their proof of concept. But this is something that is constantly emerging. And then finally, advanced metering infrastructure is gaining a little more contact and conversation in the ag community, and how can that benefit providing that next level of efficiency. Genetic engineering, we are, as I mentioned before, looking at varieties that use less water or achieve harvest a lot faster and improve the yield or maintain the yield. That is something that our researchers are doing constantly at some of our universities as well as in private enterprise. Disease-resistant varieties are becoming much more important. We have a lot of diseases and pests in a lot of the products that we produce here locally. Some of them are not at this point controllable, either through biologics or through chemicals. And so we have to figure out how can we develop those different breeds of crops so that they are resistant to some of these new emerging diseases and pests. And a lot of them are exotics because we're in a world marketplace right now. We get a lot of different things from different areas, and we have to be very careful about what we're importing and how that impacts our environment. And then finally, improving the shelf life of those crops that we're harvesting here too. Getting them to market, getting them to last longer in the shelves in the marketplace is a key to making sure that we're providing the best product that we can, as well as using the water efficiently to grow those crops. Soil biodiversity, improvements to soil practices. Again, we talked a little bit about some of this, but compost obviously is one of the big ones, but also now cover cropping. We're seeing a lot more incentives for cover cropping in some of the areas. It's a little more difficult to do in the intense agriculture and almost year-round production that we have here, but we are seeing more experiments with this in the valley. And as you drive around sometime in the last couple of weeks, you can see some of those mature cover crops in those fields yet. And then organic quality enhancements to the soil, adding mycorrhizomes, those types of things. Will they work in crop production here so that we can understand how we can continue that soil health? But the point being that I want to make here is that we've had 160 years of intensive agriculture here, and granted it's evolved, but we're still producing every year in those soils and doing a very good job of increasing yields and quality at the same time. So it's a long process, obviously, that we've developed here, but we're doing a good job of maintaining that soil health. And then finally, there are now some governmental incentives that help with some of this, programs and incentives that promote conservation practices of water, improving the infrastructure for the delivery of that water, meaning let's not have systems that leak, those types of simple but great solutions that we need to look at. Adoption of new water-saving technologies. As I mentioned, we have the Innovation Center here who is developing constantly new ways to look at water delivery and water use. And then regulatory incentives. Every agricultural producer here participates in the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program for water quality and water use, as well as healthy soils, the SWEEP program, farmers programs, all offering incentives to improve the infrastructure and the delivery of water, as well as the use. And then we're always encouraging constant improvement. That's one of the things I think our community is not necessarily always recognized for, is that we are constantly improving, constantly evolving. And I like to say that our farmers here, if they can find a way that a new practice is going to be viable and useful in the field, they're going to do it. They're going to adopt it and they're going to try it. So I broke this out into how we are doing as a community here and using all these different effective and practices, as well as some of the methods. And high adoption, we're obviously doing a very good job on micro-irrigation or drip irrigation, crop selection and rotation, water recycling, irrigation water management, and soil biodiversity. I think we're a leading county in California for a lot of these efforts. Moderate adoption, we're still working a lot more on precision irrigation practices and what that can mean for the technology in the field. Composting and mulching, obviously now we have a lot more incentives to do that through regulatory programs, as well as other programs and opportunities for grants, and then governmental incentives. Where we can really make some improvements yet are some conservation tillage, and I said that we're still experimenting with that and deciding how that's going to work in an intense agricultural setting. And then genetic engineering, that takes a long time to really put in place, takes multiple years to develop those new varieties. So we have a ways to go. We can do more, obviously, but we have accomplished a lot here in Monterey County and done a lot to really improve our water efficiency use. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions or anything that's burning on your mind at this point.
Any questions right now?
Uh-oh, I see lots of questions. I'm in trouble.
All right. Groundwater extraction was presented as an exact number, but not everyone reports extraction in Monterey County. What is the uncertainty of the extraction numbers presented? Is everyone honest in the numbers they report?
So I'll answer the first part of that by saying that the Water Resource Agency has consistently said we are above 98% in reporting for those extraction reports. So it is a very high number of people who are reporting. And if they're reporting accurately, that means it's a pretty solid number and it's a pretty solid report. Now, can I answer whether or not they're reporting accurately? We certainly hope that they are, because that's important information that we need to have. And as we see those trends over the last 25, 26 years, we can build that consistency and understand that most of those reports should be pretty solid as far as what's being reported.
What kinds of crops can benefit from no-till farm production / practices?
I think that's primarily going to fall into some of the vegetable crops, not necessarily the leafy greens crops. I think there's a lot of experimentation that is still needing to be done and how that can be accomplished in the field. There's been mixed results on some of those crops so far, but we've had some successes, and so we need to build on that. Again, I think the scalability of that is going to be important to understand. As you scale up and the acres start getting larger, it becomes much harder to manage that, as well as the pests and diseases that emerge in those situations. So I think there are some opportunities. I've seen myself in the field where they're growing broccoli and they're growing cauliflower that way. It just depends on the situation, and a lot of it is weather enhanced too. If we have really wet seasons or damp periods of time, I think that promotes more molds and more diseases in the field. So it's a constant evolving experiment that has to go on there.
So uncertainty plays a
Yes,
factor.
again.
I had to fit that in.
Thank you.
What are some of the crops in which drip irrigation cannot be used and why?
Those are primarily the baby spinach crops as well as the spring mix crops, primarily because they're harvested similar to a mechanized lawnmower situation where you're driving something over the crop itself and harvesting off the leaves mechanically, and you don't want to get plastics in that. So that's one situation. There are other crops too where that doesn't necessarily apply very well, but those are the two main ones right now that
Go ahead and repeat, if you don't mind, repeat.
Can you say that again?
Cover crop,
Oh, yes. Cover crops are another one too, where you have to use some sort of overhead sprinkler system. Thank you.
Can you talk more about what advanced metering infrastructure is?
Essentially, that is a real-time measure of water use as it comes out of a well. So that is something that is technology that may be coming, that we may need and find as necessary. But I think right now we're still in a situation where we have to look at the feasibility of how that technology can be used and also the cost of installing it, and then collecting that data and aggregating it together in a meaningful way.
Perret, is there anything, I know you have experience in AMI, is there anything you'd want to say about AMI from an urban perspective? And then I'm going to go to Janet, who had a comment, and then we're going to move on to Brenda to give the urban side of the same question. But was there anything else?
I think maybe Brenda might actually get a little bit into that.
Okay.
AMI, about 10 years ago, public urban water agencies started kind of thinking about it. The same questions came up. Is it cost effective? I went through it. I was at Scotts Valley Water District at that time, and it was amazing. The amount of money and water saved, the return on investment was like a couple of years. And it was water waste. Not that anybody was wasting, but they were not aware of what the water went, where did the water went that the meter showed. So it was just little leaks here and there. It was, little, it was my toilet was running in the middle of the night. And when people came back and in the morning, called us up and said, I did not use that water because you can set up actually an alarm that comes to your, cell phone and says 360 gallons of water in the last 24 hours. It's like, I wasn't even home. Well, there you go. So having that conversation, and not only, well, I don't know where it went, you can actually pinpoint. You said it happens every single day between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. What is going on in your house? So it was a big opening, eye-opening, task and exercise we went through, and it definitely works for the urban side. It would be interesting to see if it could be applied to small rural systems or households that are not served by, bigger public or private systems, but definitely a lot of easy, low-hanging fruit benefits from that.
Thank you. Janet, you had a comment. I can't get the microphone because it's not digital. I'm sorry. So. And you'll need to speak louder than you possibly think you need to.
I was struck by the fact that many of your proposals address the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, well, particularly mulching and biochar. So that's an additional benefit to what you're already doing, and I just thought that was an important.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, is a lot of this does control greenhouse gas emissions and improves carbon sequestration in soils as well as our crops. That is something we're actually working with Monterey County on the Climate Action Plan, and how we can get recognition in the Climate Action Plan that these practices do actually promote climate action in the positive manner. So thank you for bringing that up, Janet. I should remember to say that at all our sessions.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and change over to Brenda's presentation really fast. Let's give Norm a hand.